Hello everyone. Welcome back to my YouTube channel Amit Physiotherapy Classes. Hope all of you are getting benefited through my lecture. The today's topic is active and passive insufficiency. So let's start the topic now. Before understanding the concept of active insufficiency and passive insufficiency, let me add one point here that active insufficiency and passive insufficiency will be taking place only around two joint muscles. Now, what are two joint muscles? The muscles which are going to cross two or more joints simultaneously, they are known as two joint muscles. Let's take an example. For example, hamstring muscle. Hamstring muscle is going to cross hip and knee joint simultaneously, and the function of hamstring muscle around the hip joint will be hip extension, and around knee will be knee flexion. So, in such a way, the hamstring is going to perform actions around both the joint, that is around hip and knee both. So these type of muscles are known as two joint muscles. Now let's start with our topic, what is active and passive insufficiency. So as the definition you can see here, inability to contract muscles at the both the joint simultaneously. That is the reason why I have added the term two joint muscles, because we are going to discuss something about the two joints. So the definition says that inability to contract the muscles at both the joints simultaneously is known as active insufficiency. Means at both the joint we cannot use the function of that same particular muscle is known as active insufficiency. And what is passive insufficiency? Inability to stretch the muscle at both the joint simultaneously. Means we cannot use the function of that muscle at both the joints simultaneously to stretch that. Now let's take the example. As you can see here in diagram, we have wrist, in which one of the side there is the movement which is wrist flexion, and another side the movement is wrist extension. Now in this wrist diagram, the blue color line which is representing the active insufficiency, and the red one is representing the passive insufficiency. So let's understand with this diagram. Now in this diagram you can see the subject is trying to do the wrist flexion. So once he has done the wrist flexion, he has already shortened the wrist flexors around the wrist joint. And now the particular person, if you ask that person after doing the wrist flexion to make a fist by flexing the MCP joint, this phenomena will be not be possible, because already the subject, the person has used the wrist flexors on doing the movement of wrist flexion. So that is known as active insufficiency. And what is passive insufficiency? As I told you, the red line is going to represent passive sufficiency and blue is representing active insufficiency. Now, same example, but the movement is extension movement. When the subject is trying to do the extension movement around the wrist joint, the subject has utilized the extensors muscle to do the wrist extension, but you can see the fingers are not in extension, they are in slight flexion itself, the PIP and DIP joints. The reason behind, because we cannot do the extension of now MCP, PIP and DIP joint, because we have already used the extensors muscles to stretch it on wrist extension. So already the muscles is in such a stretched way that it cannot perform further action on another joints. So that is known as passive insufficiency. So let me explain you the same example again with the same movement, so it will become much easier for all of you. Okay, now if you see here, as I told you, blue one is active insufficiency and red is the passive insufficiency. So when person is trying to do the wrist flexion, and it is a two joint muscles, the wrist flexors are two joint muscles, they are crossing wrist, MCP, PIP and DIP. So once I have used the function of wrist flexors completely to do the wrist flexion, further this wrist flexors cannot perform to do the flexion movement around the MCP joint, because already I have used it. I have already, means already the wrist flexors are exhausted. So that is known as active insufficiency. And the same time, if you see the extensors muscles, they are already stretched on the dorsum of the forearm, on the dorsum of the wrist and forearm. So further if I try to bend this finger, or further if I try to do the flexion of this finger around the MCP joint, it's not possible, because already these extensors are stretched too much that further even the stretch is not possible. That is known as passive insufficiency. So you can see here, you have seen both the examples about the active and passive insufficiency around the same joint. Let's go with another one also. When a person is trying to do the wrist extension movement, wrist extension, so this part, the extensor part, is going in passive insufficiency, and the blue one is going in the active insufficiency. So let's understand this with one, I can say one fundamental rule. So it will be easy for you to understand what is active and passive insufficiency. So always remember the active insufficiency, the word same, and for the passive insufficiency, the word opposite. What is this? It is the same as motion as muscle function. And what is passive? It is the opposite as motion as muscle function. So let's try to understand this same and the opposite one. So here the subject is trying to do the wrist flexion movement. So on the same side of the movement, the muscles will be going in active insufficiency, and the opposite muscles will be going around the passive insufficiency. And if you see here the another movement, the subject is trying to do the wrist extension. So the movement is on this side. Okay, so this side muscles are going in active insufficiency, and opposite muscles are going in the passive insufficiency. Let's take few more examples. If we take the example of rectus femoris muscle, we know the rectus femoris is also a two joint muscle, part of the quadriceps. The function of rectus femoris around the hip is to do the hip flexion, and around the knee is to do the knee extension. Now, once the subject has done complete knee extension, and you ask the same subject to do now hip flexion also, it's not going to possible, because already they have used the function of rectus femoris on one of the joint on the knee, so they cannot utilize the further action of rectus femoris on the hip flexion. So that is known as active insufficiency. And if you see with the example of same and opposite, so the person, maybe the person is lying in supine position and they have done the knee in full extension, and they are doing hip flexion. So the movement is going in upward direction to do the hip flexion, and on the upward direction only, on the upward part only, the rectus femoris is present. So that is on the same side. So that is known as active insufficiency. And the opposite muscle is hamstring. Opposite muscle is hamstring. So hamstring will be going under the passive insufficiency. I hope you understood this concept. Let's take in another way. Let's make hamstring as active and rectus as passive. So full knee flexion and full hip extension cannot be achieved simultaneously due to shortening of hamstring muscle. Now, for example, I am making a subject to stand in a erect position, and the person is trying to do the extension of the hip. Now on the same time, you ask the subject after doing the hip extension to do the knee flexion. It will be not be possible, because we have used the hamstring function of doing hip extension on hip, and now we cannot use the full action of the hamstring on the knee to do the flexion. So if you see the movement, if this person is standing and this is the knee, this is the hip joint, this is the knee joint, if the person has already done the extension of the hip, they have utilized the muscle and they cannot perform the knee flexion. So the movement is in this direction. So on this back side, we have the muscle hamstring. So hamstring is going for active insufficiency, and the front muscle, this is the way to stretch the quadriceps also. So you will be unable to stretch the quadriceps, you will be unable to stretch the rectus femoris completely if you have done the hip extension and then you are trying to do the knee flexion. That is the reason when you try to stretch the rectus femoris, the hip should be in neutral, and then you try to do the knee flexion, then you will be getting the stretch on the quadriceps muscle. So this was the concept for active and passive insufficiency. Thank you so much.